June 6, 1944. As the landing craft carrying the invading Allied ground forces of Operation Overlord motored toward the Normandy beaches, they were protected and supported by the largest aerial armada the world has ever seen. In spite of medium-level clouds, a covering umbrella of American and British fighters kept the skies clear of German fighters. Squadrons of Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers and fighter bombers came in low over the beaches to bomb and strafe German positions and gun emplacements on the shore. Large formations of Martin B-26 Marauder medium bombers dumped their bomb loads on German gun positions a few minutes before H-hour. A stream of glider-towing transports passed over the ships that had brought the troops across the English Channel. Earlier that morning, those same transports delivered loads of American and British paratroopers onto the drop zones around the town of Saint-Mère-Église. The American light and medium bombers, fighter bombers, and transports were all from Lieutenant General Lewis H. Brereton's United States 9th Air Force. Along with the British 2nd Tactical Air Force, the 9th Air Force was formed specifically to support the ground forces, whose lot was to fight in Western Europe. The D-Day landings commenced the final and best-known period of 9th Air Force's wartime service, but by June 6, 1944, it had been in combat almost 2 years and was in the second phase of its colorful history. Furthermore, the 9th Air Force of Normandy and Western Europe took an entirely different role than it played in 1942 and 1943, when it was a multifunction U.S. Army Air Force assigned to support British forces and conduct strategic bombing operations in the Middle East. The creation of the unit that came to be known as the 9th Air Force occurred in a somewhat roundabout manner, primarily as a result of Allied reactions to enemy activity in different parts of the globe. In early 1942, the Allied Combined Chiefs of Staff decided to consider the Far East and Middle East as interdependent areas of operation, with resources to be allocated according to the military situation at the time. The air routes that had been established from the United States and Europe to the Far East passed through the Middle East, so it was logical to consider the two areas together when it came to reinforcement in time of emergency.
Aircraft and combat units from either area of operation could be rushed to the other, considering that they were on opposite sides of the vast Asian continent. Consequently, when the Japanese gained the advantage in Burma and China in the wake of the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, thus ruling out planned heavy bomber operations against Japan, the U.S. War Department decided to halt some of the combat units that had been destined for China in the Middle East to meet an emerging threat. The British 8th Army was battling the Afrika Korps. The decision was prompted, at least in part, by German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's new offensive in Libya and western Egypt, and the resulting threat to Cairo and Palestine.
The first American air unit to serve in the Middle East was a special project under the command of Colonel Harry Halverson, known as the Halverson Project, HALPRO for short. HALPRO was made up of a squadron of consolidated B-24D Liberator bombers, whose original mission had been to serve as the nucleus of a heavy bomber force based in China to begin a strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese mainland. Another force, under the command of Colonel Caleb Haynes, known as AQUILA, had already arrived in India with a handful of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers and Douglas C-47 Skytrain transports with the same purpose in mind. These two forces were to combine and launch impact bombing campaigns on Japan. Before the heavy bombers arrived, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized a daring attack on Japan by Army B-25 Mitchell medium bombers launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. Although news of the raid was seen as a means of raising American morale, it was a disaster for the Chinese, as Japanese troops invaded all areas from which future air attacks against Japan could be launched, killing more than 250,000 Chinese civilians in the process. Japanese troops took control of the regions where the bomber bases were under construction, leaving the B-17s and B-24s without an Asian mission. The HALPRO force was halted in the Middle East, and the Aquila B-17s were ultimately ordered to Palestine as well. The commander of the new Middle Eastern Air Force was Major General Louis H. Brereton, who came to the assignment in a manner even more roundabout than the creation of his new command. Brereton, who was one of the highest-ranking officers in the Air Corps before the war, was in the Philippines on December 8, 1941, where he had just assumed command of the Far East Air Forces. 2 weeks later, President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill agreed to abandon the Philippines to their fate, and Brereton and his headquarters were ordered to Australia to organize an Allied air effort against the Japanese.
Brereton was only in Australia for a little over 2 months. In March 1942, he transferred to India to organize and take command of the 10th Air Force, a new organization planned for operations in the China-Burma-India theater. Brereton's stay in India was also short-lived. In June, he was ordered to Cairo to take command of American air operations in the Middle East. He was also ordered to take any available bombers and all of the transports in India with him. The B-17s of the 9th Bombardment Squadron, the former Aquila project, were part of the move. In 1941, after an inspection trip of British air forces in the region, Major General George Brett recommended the long-range B-24 Liberator as the ideal heavy bomber for the Middle East, and deliveries of the 4-engine bombers to the Royal Air Force soon commenced. By mid-1942, when the first American air units arrived, one squadron of Royal Air Force Liberators was operational in Palestine. When America entered the war, the British immediately requested the assignment of American heavy bombers to the Middle East, but the air staff balked, reasoning that any bombers sent there would take away from the planned buildup of a heavy bomber force in Britain.
The changing military situation in Libya and Egypt led to a change of heart. The War Department decided to establish an air force in the Middle East with 1 heavy bomber group, 2 of medium bombers, and 6 pursuit groups. Brereton's new command was initially organized as the Middle Eastern Air Force, but plans were laid for it to become the 9th Air Force once all of the necessary units had reached the theater. As the situation in China deteriorated, ruining American plans for an air offensive against Japan from Chinese bases, Army Air Forces Commander General Henry Hap Arnold obtained permission from President Roosevelt to halt the secret HALPRO force in the Middle East. Arnold planned to use the B-24s for a strike on the oil refinery complex at Ploesti, Romania, which was the largest single source of all German gasoline and oil supplies and one of the most important targets in the ETO. The mission against Ploesti was flown on the night of June 12, 1942, with negligible results, but it did have the distinction of being the first American bombing mission of the war with strategic objectives. 9th Air Force would be going back to Ploesti. After the first Ploesti mission, HALPRO remained at Lydda, Palestine, as the HAL Squadron for operations in support of the British 8th Army against Rommel's Africa Corps. Its B-24s and the 9th Bombardment Squadron's B-17s formed the nucleus of what would become the IX Bomber Command. On July 20th, the 2 squadrons were organized into the 1st Provisional Group, Bombardment. The combined strength of the HAL and 9th Squadrons amounted to only 28 heavy bombers, 19 B-24s, and 9 B-17s. Although the number of Liberators would increase, B-17 strength remained at less than a dozen airplanes.
The American bombers joined with RAF Liberators in attacks on Axis shipping in the Mediterranean and targets in North Africa and along the Mediterranean shore. Although the American and British Liberators struck targets as far west as Benghazi, Libya, the B-17's limited range restricted them to missions no farther than Tobruk. Reinforcements for the Middle Eastern Air Force came in late July when the 344th Bombardment Squadron arrived as the advance element of the 98th Bombardment Group, which was on its way to Palestine from Florida. The 98th Group headquarters arrived by ship in mid-August along with personnel of the 57th Fighter Group,
equipped with Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk fighters and the first American fighter group assigned to the Middle East. Meanwhile, a group of medium bombers, B-25s of the 12th Bombardment Group, crossed the South Atlantic, then flew up through Central Africa to its new base in Egypt. Both the 12th Bombardment Group and the 57th Fighter Group went into training with the British before entering combat in North Africa.
The original comprehensive War Department plans for air strength in the Middle East were never reached, although heavy bomber strength would increase to twice that originally planned. Political maneuvering cost the Middle Eastern Air Forces some of its projected assets when newly promoted Brigadier General James H. Doolittle, who enjoyed star status in Washington because of his Tokyo raid, put pressure on Arnold to let him have the 33rd Fighter Group for his new 12th Air Force. The 12th Air Force was being formed to support the American landings at Casablanca, and it was siphoning off assets from other organizations. There was mixed reaction in Washington to the request, as most of the air staff believed air superiority over the Western Desert would be beneficial to the overall success of the Allied campaign in North Africa. The War Department chose to leave the decision up to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was to command the invasion force. Ike naturally wanted the group under his personal command, so the 33rd went to 12th. As a replacement for the 33rd, and in recognition of the need for P-40s in Egypt, the War Department elected to send the 79th Fighter Group to the Middle East. Although the group arrived in October and many of its pilots flew combat missions with other organizations, the 79th did not become operational as a combat unit until the spring of 1943. Without their own fighter escorts, the 57th Group P-40s were working with the British Western Desert Air Force. The Middle Eastern Air Force heavy bombers were forced to depend on the RAF for escort or to go it alone to their targets. Unlike Generals Ira Aker and Carl Spaatz, who had gone to England to organize a daylight bombing campaign, Brereton was not hamstrung with the desire to prove American theories on daylight bombing, so his bombers operated at night as well as by day.
Losses among heavy bombers operating in the Middle East were fairly light, especially in comparison to those starting to occur among the 8th Air Force bombers on daylight missions over Western Europe. The heavy bombers were achieving considerable success as they struck targets all along the North African coast. Several ships were hit and some were sunk, and sticks of bombs fell on warehouses adjacent to the docks at Mediterranean ports. On the night of September 22, 1943, the B-24s hit an ammunition-laden ship at Benghazi and blew it up, causing major damage to the harbor facilities. The brunt of the task was borne by the liberators, since the fortresses lacked the range to reach Benghazi from their bases in Palestine. The shorter-range B-17s joined British Vickers-Wellington bombers and American B-25s in strikes on Tobruk. Before American ground forces landed at Casablanca in early November, the British 8th Army met and defeated the Afrika Korps at El Alamein in the decisive battle of the North African Campaign. Prior to the battle, the RAF had more than 1,000 aircraft of all types in North Africa. U.S. Army Air Force's strength stood at 56 P-40s, 46 B-25s, and 63 heavy bombers, of which 10 were the war-weary B-17s Brereton had brought with him from India. Allied air strength outnumbered that of the Axis considerably. The Luftwaffe was tied down on the Eastern Front, where things had not gone well for the Germans since the previous winter. El Alamein was the first significant engagement for the U.S. fighters, and the P-40 pilots of the 57th Fighter Group made a good showing. They joined with RAF P-40s in fighter-bomber attacks on German positions and engaged German and Italian planes in the air.
Throughout the summer of 1942, the formal organization of the Middle Eastern Air Forces was limited. In October, the 9th Bomber Command was staffed, although the command itself remained in an unofficial status. Colonel Patrick Timberlake of Brereton's staff took issue with British claims to control of the American heavy bombers, asserting that it was a violation of an agreement worked out between General Arnold and key British leaders that called for homogeneous American formations.
While Timberlake conceded that it might be appropriate for the U.S. fighter and medium bomber groups, of which there was one of each in the Middle East at the time, to operate under British control, American heavy bombers constituted 4/5 of the heavy bomber strength in the theater. As a result of Timberlake's memo, the British agreed to the establishment of an American Bomber Command in Cairo, then went so far as to turn over their own Liberator Squadron to its control. Timberlake was placed in command of the new 9th Bomber Command. On November 8, 1942, Lieutenant General Frank Andrews took command of the U.S. Army Air Force's Middle East. The senior U.S. Army officer in the area, Andrews was an Air Corps officer who had his own ideas on organization of air forces, ideas that were becoming widely accepted in the overseas commands. 4 days after assuming command of the theater, Andrews issued a general order establishing the 9th U.S. Army Air Force with Brereton in command. On the same day, Brereton activated 9th Headquarters Squadron and 9th Service Command. Although it was already functioning in an unofficial status, 9th Bomber Command was formally established 2 weeks later on November 27th. With American troops ashore at Casablanca, the British 8th Army began advancing westward into Libya. The 9th Bomber Command moved its bases to the Nile Delta from Palestine and established forward bases just west of Tobruk. On November 1, the 1st Provisional Group was reformed to become the 376th Bombardment Group, giving 9th Bomber Command 2 full groups of B-24s. The remnants of the HALPRO force were reinforced and replaced by new personnel with new airplanes coming in from the United States. A single squadron of B-17s remained in the command, but their slower speed and limited range prevented them from operating effectively with the Liberators.
After the Casablanca landings, 2 B-17 groups left the 8th Air Force in England and moved to North Africa to join Doolittle's 12th Air Force. In December, the 93rd Bombardment Group, one of 2 B-24 groups in the 8th Air Force, was deployed under temporary duty orders to North Africa with 3 of its 4 squadrons to supplement 12th Bomber Command. The 93rd flew a couple of missions out of Algiers, then moved to Western Egypt to join 9th Bomber Command, where its B-24Ds would be operating with identical types. With the arrival of the 93rd, 9th Bomber Command had control of 3 heavy bomber groups, a formidable force, and was able to begin mounting formations of considerable size. In return for the 93rd, the 9th Bombardment Squadron and its B-17s departed Egypt for North Africa and 12th Air Force, leaving the 9th Bomber Command as an all B-24 force, since the B-25s of the 12th Bombardment Group were still operating under British control. Throughout December and most of January, 9th Bomber Command concentrated its efforts on German targets in Tunisia. On January 2nd, the 12th Bombardment Group's B-25s, which had previously operated under British control, joined the B-24s in an attack on Crete. It was the first mission for the medium bombers as part of 9th Bomber Command. An untimely dust storm wreaked havoc with the Mitchells. Only 12 of a planned 36 were able to take off, and one of those turned back without reaching the target. 11 Mitchells bombed their target, but 2 were lost on the return flight. Most of the others failed to make it back to their home base because of excessive fuel consumption and had to put down on other fields. By January, 2 additional fighter groups had arrived in the theater, the promised 79th and the 324th. Like the 57th that preceded them, the new groups were equipped with P-40s. 9th Air Force also had received its own troop carrier group, the 316th, which was originally intended to go to a project in the Caucasus. The fighters continued to operate with the British, while the troop carrier transports went to work hauling supplies for the fighter and bomber squadrons and supporting the British ground forces. Air evacuation of casualties was a major mission of the troop carriers.
After the capture of Tripoli, 9th Bomber Command turned its attention toward targets in Europe, specifically Naples, Messina, and Palermo. The 3 cities were important links in the Axis supply chain to Tunisia. The B-24s were still based in the Nile Delta, but staged out of a forward base at Gambut near Tobruk, where the bombers were refueled before departing for the long missions to Sicily and Italy.
In late January, the B-24 groups left the Nile Delta and moved the 300 miles to Gamboot, Maine. The 93rd Bomb Group returned to England and the 8th Air Force, but it would soon be back. With the Allied victory in Tunisia, the 9th Air Force turned toward the reduction of enemy defenses and transportation centers in preparation for the upcoming invasion of Sicily. Liberators of the 9th Bomber Command joined with 12th Air Force B-17s in attacks on targets in Italy and airfields and other complexes in Sicily. Some of the 12th Bombardment Group's B-25s were attached to 12th Air Force to support the invasion. In preparation for the landings, 9th Bomber Command was reinforced with 3 8th Air Force B-24 groups, the veteran 93rd, which had served with 9th Bomber Command in the winter, along with the 44th and 389th groups. At the time, the three groups constituted all of 8th Bomber Command's Liberator strength. The new groups joined the 98th and 376th at bases in the vicinity of Benghazi, Libya, and participated in raids on targets in support of the upcoming invasion of Sicily. On July 19th, 9th Bomber Command's B-24s, supplemented by the 8th Air Force groups, joined 12th Air Force B-17s in an attack on railroad marshalling yards around Rome. The arrival of the additional B-24s from England had a dual purpose. Not only were they there to increase heavy bomber strength in the Mediterranean for the Sicily campaign, their presence was prompted to a large degree by the most ambitious plan of the war, a low-level attack on the Ploesti oil fields, the same target that led to the assignment of the HALPRO force to the Middle East. On August 1, 1943, 5 B-24 groups departed Benghazi and set out across the Mediterranean for Ploesti. The B-24s came in over the refineries at treetop level in the face of intense enemy fire. In spite of heavy casualties, most crews managed to put their bombs into the refinery complex, although some of the groups struck targets other than the ones they had been assigned. A navigational error on the part of the lead formation caused some of the B-24s to fail to bomb their intended targets, and most of one group failed to bomb the refineries at all, causing the mission to be less of a success than planned. Less than 2 weeks later, the combined force of liberators struck the aircraft factories at Wiener Neustadt, Austria.
Combined Bomber Offensive. Once Allied troops were ashore in Sicily and Italy, the Army Air Forces began a massive reorganization in preparation for the invasion of Normandy. At the Casablanca Conference in early 1943, the Allied leaders agreed to conduct a combined bomber offensive against Germany from British and Italian bases. The 8th Air Force in England would be the northern arm of the American Strategic Bomber Force, and plans were made for the creation of a second force that would attack targets in Germany from the south. A new headquarters derived from Headquarters 8th Air Force, the U.S. Strategic Air Forces, was planned to control heavy bomber operations against Germany. The success of RAF, 9th and 12th Air Force fighter bombers and light and medium bombers in support of ground forces led to the decision to also establish tactical air forces dedicated to ground support. The result was the decision to transfer 9th Air Force to England, where it would become the American Tactical Air Force responsible for supporting the Normandy landings and subsequent ground operations in Western Europe. The RAF established a counterpart as 2nd Tactical Air Force. In preparation for the move, the 9th's fighter and medium bomber groups transferred to 12th Air Force, which had been given the same mission in the Mediterranean, and IX Bomber Command's 2 B-24 groups joined the B-17s from the 12th Air Force to form the newly established 15th Air Force. The idea for a separate tactical air force in England had been developed as early as May 1943, with initial plans for it to emanate from the 8th Support Command. The unit started appearing in planning papers as the 8th Tactical Air Force, but plans were soon made to form an Air Force-level unit entirely separate from and equal to the 8th Air Force. On July 31st, General Arnold offered command of the new unit to General Brereton, since plans were already underway for 9th Air Force assets in the Middle East and North Africa to be rolled into the 12th Air Force and for the heavy bombers to go to the new 15th. Having served in 3 theaters and several major campaigns, Brereton was the most widely experienced general officer in the U.S. Army. He arrived in England on September 10th, where he conferred with Lieutenant General Ira Aker, who at the time was the senior U.S. officer in England, then departed for the United States for a meeting with Arnold and a short leave. Brereton was back in England by mid-October. During the various discussions, the Army Air Force's staff had decided that only the 9th Air Force headquarters and the headquarters of the IX bomber, fighter, and service commands would go to England. 8th Air Force would provide 9th with its initial combat and service units, but the bulk of the new tactical Air Force would come with units arriving from the United States.
On October 15th, 4 medium bomber and 2 troop carrier groups transferred from the 8th to the 9th Air Force to become its first operational units in England. The 322nd, 323rd, 386th, and 387th Bombardment Groups were equipped with Martin B-26 medium bombers, while the troop carrier groups flew Douglas C-47s. The first fighter group to join the new 9th Air Force was the 354th, a unit whose arrival in England was a milestone in the air war since it was equipped with North American P-51B Mustangs at a time when U.S. fighter squadrons in Europe were equipped with Lockheed P-38 Lightnings and Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. Several 8th Fighter Command pilots, including Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakesley, were temporarily assigned to the 354th to train the newly arrived pilots for combat. They were so impressed with the P-51 that they mounted a campaign to have all future P-51 groups assigned to 8th Fighter Command. Their campaign was successful, and by mid-1944, most of the 8th's fighter groups were equipping with Mustangs, and the P-47s they had been flying were going to groups assigned to 9th. Although initial plans called for several P-51 groups with the 9th, only 2 Mustang-equipped fighter groups and a reconnaissance group were actually assigned to the 9th Air Force. All of the other fighter groups flew P-47s, except for 3 groups that were equipped with P-38s. The diversion of the P-51s to 8th Fighter Command came about because of military politics, which seemed to be prevalent in the European theater. In late 1943, General Carl Spaatz returned to England, and in early January, he took command of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces Europe, the new command that had been created to oversee U.S. Army heavy bomber operations against Germany. As the senior Army Air Forces officer in Europe, Spaatz lost no time exerting the power of his new rank and position. He sought to exercise control over all U.S. air units in England, especially 9th Air Force. During the planning for the new Tactical Air Force, Brereton and Army Air Forces planners had visualized it as an independent command apart from the Strategic Bomber Forces, since its mission was the dedicated support of the ground war. When he got wind of the plan, Spaatz became incensed. As the senior air officer in Europe, he did not wish to have another Army Air Forces command operating on what he considered to be his private turf. In a preemptive move, he wrote a strong letter to Brereton, making it clear that he was going to control the 9th Air Force, and furthermore, that he would be the link in the chain of command between the 9th Air Force and headquarters, U.S. Army Air Forces in Washington. Brereton and his staff were already inclined to believe that Spaatz was discriminating against them in favor of the 8th Air Force. Spaatz outranked Brereton, both in military rank and command authority, so the 9th Air Force commander was in no position to dispute the senior commander's authority. Several senior officers in Washington felt that it was a mistake for a strategic bombing organization to have control of an air force that was charged with supporting ground forces. But in the end, Arnold went along with Spaatz. This arrangement was problematic, but as the D-Day landings approached, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower temporarily solved the problem by placing all of the air units under his direct command. Eisenhower issued an order that all air operations, including heavy bombers, would be in support of the ground forces until the Normandy beachhead had been established.
Throughout the winter months of 1943-1944, the 9th Air Force was augmented. The 4 B-26 groups of IX Bomber Command were beefed up with the addition of 4 more medium bomber groups of B-26s and 3 light bombardment groups equipped with Douglas A-20s. One of the missions of the 9th Air Force would be to provide troop carrier support for airborne and ground forces, and the building up of IX Troop Carrier Command was a priority. The training and equipping of troop carrier groups in the United States had reached the saturation point, and it was not until a few weeks before D-Day that Troop Carrier Command reached its planned strength of 14 groups, including some 2,700 gliders. Future events revealed that this was not enough, as the demands for troop carrier aircraft by the advancing ground and air units exceeded availability. The buildup of fighter forces went more smoothly. By May, the 9th Air Force had received 18 fighter groups, with some 1,500 aircraft assigned, including reconnaissance and night fighter squadrons. Fighter strength was divided into 2 tactical commands, with the bulk of the fighters assigned to the IX Tactical Air Command, or TAC, while 2 wings with a total of 7 groups were assigned to a second command, designated as the 19th TAC. The 19th TAC was dedicated to the support of General George Patton's 3rd Army. For the first several months of 9th Air Force operations out of England, its fighters and bombers functioned essentially under the control of the 8th Air Force. The IX Bomber Command first mission was to Évreux-Falville Airfield, a Luftwaffe base some 50 miles west of Paris. Spots hoped that the medium bombers would divert German fighters away from B-17 and B-24 formations on their way to Germany. But the Luftwaffe left the B-26s alone and continued to hit the heavies. 9th fighters were assigned to escort missions, a task that took them away from training for the vitally important mission of providing close air support for the ground forces once they were ashore in Normandy.
The first 9th Air Force fighter mission was flown on December 1, 1943, when a 28-plane formation of P-51s flew a sweep over northeastern France. 4 days later, the 354th Fighter Group flew its first escort mission as it accompanied bombers to Amiens. On December 13th, the new P-51s joined with P-38s from the 8th 55th Fighter Group, escorting B-17s on a 490-mile mission to Kiel, the longest escort mission to date. The IX Bomber Command's B-26s focused on B weapon sites in February, and on the 8th, they flew their first double mission day. As the heavy bombers went into Germany during Big Week on February 24 and 25, the B-26s struck German airfields in Holland and B weapon sites in France. Attacks on buzz bomb launch sites continued into March, but during the middle of the month, the B-26s switched to German transportation targets in preparation for the upcoming invasion. In mid-March, the IX Fighter Command began fighter-bomber attacks on targets on the continent. This was the mission for which the IX and XIX Fighter Commands had been established, and on May 20th, the 9th Air Force started referring to its groups as fighter-bomber groups and squadrons instead of simply fighter groups. Fighter bombers struck railroad marshalling yards, V-weapon launch sites, airfields, railroads, bridges, and essentially any target that would reduce the Germans' ability to reinforce their units in the vicinity of the Normandy beaches. When the possibility was presented, the fighter bombers fought the Luftwaffe in the air. The 9th Air Force was charged with the major responsibility for covering the beaches on D-Day. While British Spitfires were assigned to provide low cover, 5 groups of P-47s were to maintain high cover. P-38s would operate over the ships. 2 other P-38 groups and 4 P-47 groups were assigned to strike gun batteries just before the troops hit the beach. The 11 A-20 and B-26 groups bombed German heavy gun batteries on the beaches, then hit bunkers behind Utah Beach. From June 6th forward, the air war became a 9th Air Force and 2 Tactical Air Force show. Although the 8th and 15th Air Forces and RAF Bomber Command continued their strategic bombing campaign against German cities and industrial targets, the primary mission of the Air Forces was now to support the troops on the ground. And support they did, so much so that General Patton came to think of the fighter bombers of the XIX Tactical Air Command as the protection for his flanks. Patton considered the XIX TAC and Brig Gen O.P. Wayland, its commander, as part of 3rd Army, and came to depend heavily on the fighter bombers as he planned the daring attacks for which he is famous.
One of the greatest ironies of World War II is that the 8th Air Force immediately became obsolete with the Allied victory in Europe. But the kind of warfare introduced by the 9th Air Force was the wave of the future. Nearly all of the B-17s and B-24s that survived the war had been turned to scrap metal within a few years. But the fighter-bomber concept has survived through the jet age. High-performance jet fighter bombers have become the most powerful weapons of modern warfare.
Thank you so much to watch video to end, and don't forget to like and leave comment and subscribe to our channel. See you next video.